I recently had the joy and the incredible privilege of being led on a tour by Dr. Simon Horobin at the University of Oxford through Magdalen College. An impressive scholar, he shared his wealth of C.S. Lewis knowledge with such humility. He's regarded in my notes as a very sweet gentleman. In addition to that most sophisticated title, he is also a professor of English language and literature, as well as fellow and tutor in English at Magdalen College. He's recently compiled extensive research into a wonderful book entitled C.S. Lewis's Oxford, which offers an intensive look into Lewis's life and work there. And we do have the man himself, as Dr. J.R.R. said, all the way from Oxford. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Simon Horobin.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Amber, and thank you to Jason and everyone here at the team and organised this wonderful event and for inviting me to be here. I think one of the great joys of working on C.S. Lewis is all the people that you meet, and it's fantastic to meet old friends, meet new ones, and to meet the people whose work you've been reading and quoting. So it's been a great privilege for me. So I'm going to talk about Lewis, Tolkien, and the Oxford English School, which is obviously a subject very close to my heart because I work in the I work in the Oxford English School, and many of the issues that I'll be talking about are still ones that really affect us and are very much live today. In his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis recounts his journey from atheism to theism and then to Christianity, a conversion that owed a great deal to his friendship with his colleague in the English faculty, J.R.R. Tolkien, a story I'm sure we all know well. But I want to talk about a slightly less well-known two-stage conversion in Lewis's early life. That is, firstly, from a student of what we in Oxford call literae humaniores, which everyone else would call just classics, to the School of English Language and Literature, and then the second stage, which saw him embrace the discipline of philology, a process of conversion that was also greatly influenced by his colleague Tolkien. Lewis's initial disdain for the study of philology, that's really the historical study of the English language, is recorded in entries in his diaries and his letters, but also in a series of newly discovered poems that he composed during the 1920s, which I'll be sharing with you this evening. While Tolkien may have publicly succeeded in recruiting Lewis to his side in the syllabus wars that divided the Oxford English faculty, Lewis, as we shall see, continued privately in occasional verse to vent his animosity towards the subject, and particularly to its leading Oxford exponent, a man called Henry Cecil Wilde. That's a picture of him. So it was in 1922 that Lewis began his English degree. It was at the suggestion of his philosophy tutor at University College, E.F. Carrett. And Carrett proposed it because he thought it would make Lewis more employable, because English was a relatively new subject in Oxford in those days, and so there were likely to be more jobs as the subject expanded. Coming from what was considered to be the more prestigious school of literae humaniores, in which he'd already secured a double first, Lewis was initially rather disparaging of his fellow students, complaining about a certain amateurishness in the talk and look of the people. But his particular scorn was reserved for the philological component of the degree, as recorded in numerous entries in his diary that he kept during that period. And we can see the first signs of that lack of sympathy with the subject in his reflections on his Old English tutorials with Miss E. Wardale of St. Hugh's College, whose highly successful Grammar of Old English had been recently published in 1922. And here's a painting of some of the St. Hugh's tutors from the time, and she's the sort of second from the left. I'm not going to read you Lewis's somewhat unflattering description of her. Lewis was not enamoured of her philological approach to the topic of Old English, finding her teaching too concerned with phonology, as the history of sounds, and linguistic theory, which he says are delightful subjects, no doubt, but then life is short. Later that same term, Lewis was startled when Wardale set him an essay on phonetics and the sound laws in which she had been instructing him, admitting privately to his diary that he'd not attended to any of it. In order to tackle the paper, he went to the library and consulted an elementary textbook on the subject, one by Henry Cecil Wilde. And here he records how he spent 2 hours puzzling over phonetics, backward voice stops, glides, glottal catches, and open Lord knows what, concluding, sardonically, very good stuff in its way. But why physiology should form part of the English school, I really don't know. So despite those unpromising beginnings in the subject, Lewis, of course, went on to achieve another first-class degree, this one in English, and he completed what is a 2-year final honours school course in just a single year. And of course, in 1926, Carrett's advice paid off, and Lewis was elected to the first official fellowship in English language and literature at Magdalen College. Now, as poacher turned gamekeeper, Lewis found himself having to drill his students in precisely those same elements of Old English philology that he himself had despised. And it didn't go particularly well. One of his first pupils was, of course, the future poet John Betjeman, whose antipathy for the subject is well known, and tested Lewis's patience to the limit, prompting him to confess to his diary, "I wish I could get rid of this idle prig." Betjeman, of course, did very little work and constantly came up with unconvincing excuses as to why he hadn't produced his essay, like having measles, and then he turned up to his tutorial famously in bedroom slippers, and never really committed himself to the subject at all, and eventually left Oxford without a degree. And his fellow student, Henry Yorke, who was later a novelist under the pseudonym Henry Green, similarly struggled with the philological focus of the Oxford English course. And in his memoir, Pack My Bag, Green observed that as an English student, he had been required to learn Anglo-Saxon. This, he says, I could not do. Not all students were so unwilling to engage with this topic. While marking one student's essay on the history of English, Lewis found himself having to check certain relevant facts, and this required him to purchase a copy of Wilde's Historical Study of the Mother Tongue, 1906. But frustratingly, despite having gone out specially to buy it from Blackwell's, he was still unable to locate the required information. And in January the following year, Lewis spent an entire morning poring over the book, which leads him to exclaim in his diary, "A curse beyond Wilde." And the next day he went back to it again, and he said he tried to discover everything Wilde has to say on the subject, in spite of all he does to prevent me. He found the partial explanation of sound change and their outputs particularly frustrating, leading him to exclaim, "Are all philologists mad?" And that was the alternative title I was toying with for this talk. Lewis's low opinion of the subject extended to the lectures by Henry Cecil Wilde, the same person whose books he had been studying. Having attended a series as an undergraduate of a lecture series called Outlines of the History of English, Lewis lamented the lack of new information on offer. He says, he spoke for an hour and told us nothing I haven't known these 5 years, remarking that language consists of sounds, not letters, and its growth did not depend on conscious changes by individuals, that 2 and 2 make 4, and other deep truths of that kind. As well as the elementary nature of Wilde's approach, Lewis took exception to his tendency in the lectures to harangue members of his audience. And it was that hectoring style that prompts Lewis to refer to Wilde simply as the cad throughout the rest of his diary. He's not a gentleman. In one lecture, the subject of Wilde's attack was the poet Robert Bridges, as well as another unnamed opponent who lectured erroneously on English pronunciation and who Wilde claimed to have conquered in the ensuing discussion. But more commonly, the target of Wilde's rebukes were the very students that made up his audience. On one occasion, Lewis records Wilde turning to an unsuspecting young man in the front row and bellowing at him, "Do you understand that? Could you give an explanation of that?" And when the student made no response at all, Wilde shouted, "You weren't listening, were you? I should advise you to listen if I were you." Sharing that story with a fellow student revealed that these kinds of haranguings were quite common with Wilde. On one occasion, he bellowed at a young girl flicking through her book, "Haven't you found the place yet? I'm not going to lecture in this Sunday school way." And Lewis adds in his diary, "I began to understand why the great school," that's classics, "was called literae humaniores, i.e. more humane letters." According to one of Lewis's friends, Wilde had been heard to boast an enjoyment of frightening students during vivas. During his period working at Liverpool University before he'd come to Oxford, female candidates regularly left his room in tears. Another lecture that Lewis attended in February 1923 on Middle English dialects was full of Wilde's usual tricks, including a tirade against people who lacked a detailed knowledge of the subject that they were coming to the lecture to find out about. Along with complaints about timekeeping, poor concentration, and a general lack of knowledge, Wilde took issue with his audience's use of fashionable, what he called superfine pronunciations of words like waistcoat. "You may pronounce it in this way," he's reported to have said, picking out some poor terrified individual in the front row, "but I prefer the more gentlemanly pronunciation of waistcoat." So Wilde here appears to be contradicting his own claim that language change is subconscious. Language changes without people interfering with it, because now he's blaming shifting pronunciations on the self-consciously fashionable usage of the younger generation, while attempting to curtail such developments by stubbornly holding on to his own old-school personal preferences. Waistcoat is simply a spelling pronunciation. It's been triggered by mimicking the spelling in the pronunciation. What's driving Wilde's determination to preserve waistcoat is a series of assumptions about correctness and class that underpin many of Wilde's writings, despite his attempts to assert a scientific and disinterested approach to language study. So Wilde, in his writings, claims that the study of philology is an empirical science. When comparing different linguistic varieties, the philologist observes and records variation in a dispassionate and impartial way. He says, "We collect varieties in speech as an entomologist brings together different kinds of moth. We do not love the one and despise the other. We simply observe and compare them." But this stance of scientific objectivity found itself on slippery ground when Wilde tried to determine when dialect usage was acceptable and when it was not. So he says, the first thing to realize is that in itself a provincial or regional dialect is just as respectable and historically quite as interesting as standard English. The next thing is to realize that if you want to speak good standard English, pronunciations which belong typically to a provincial dialect are out of place. It's probably wise and useful to get rid of these provincialisms since they attract attention and often ridicule in polite circles. For Wilde, the 1920s, the point at which he's lecturing to Lewis, were the high watermark of a distinguished career that had begun at Oxford, where he read philology under Henry Sweet, followed by a lectureship and then appointment to the Baines Chair of English Language at Liverpool University, returning to Oxford to take up the Merton Chair of English Language and Literature in 1920. Wilde was the author of numerous influential textbooks on the history of the English language. His book, A History of Modern Colloquial English, which came out in 1920, was reprinted many times and defines the study of the subject through at least the first half of the 20th century. So that's where I want to pause for a moment, because that was sort of where my interest came in with Lewis's work on philology and his interactions with H.C. Wilde. And to sort of explain what comes next, I want to just take you back to the point at which I first arrived myself in Oxford, which is now 18 years ago, as a tutor at Magdalen College. And I think because of that association, when I first arrived, I received a number of invitations from various people to come and speak about C.S. Lewis to different groups. And I can remember vividly having to write back and say, I'm really sorry, I may be in this position, but I don't actually know much about C.S. Lewis. And that turned out that was a bit awkward. So eventually I thought I'd better find out some stuff. And one thing I did, it was actually the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society asking me to come and speak, that I thought, well, I could give a paper about Lewis and Chaucer, which was an interest of mine. And I was telling a colleague of mine in the faculty about this paper, and he said, oh, I happen to have a complete set of the Clarendon Chaucer, the 6-volume edition edited by W. Skeat, which was owned by Lewis. Do you want to borrow it? I thought, well, that really would be useful. And that was just crammed full of really interesting notes, which helped me to sort of, to see Lewis at work on Chaucer in a whole different dimension. And that's what got me really interested in Lewis as a reader, as a scholar, as an annotator. It sort of started off that interest. But then at the paper itself, at the end, I met Walter Hooper, who very kindly had turned up and then invited me to come to his house for a cup of tea so that he could show me some more volumes that he owned, that had been owned by Lewis and annotated by him. And so it was when I was at Walter's house looking through, all the treasures that he had on his bookshelf, amongst a number of, of obvious kind of items you'd expect to find, a copy of Phantastes, for instance, or a copy of The Hobbit, was a copy of The Short History of English by H.C. Wilde. I thought, that's odd. Lewis hated Wilde. Why on earth has that one survived? Why would it still be, in anybody's possession at this point? He found the whole thing deeply frustrating, and resented everything he had to do with Wilde. Anyway, I picked it up off the shelf and started flicking through it, and then I realised why. Because in it are a number of poems. So this is a picture of the title page, Short History of English, Lewis's signature, and then with a poem in Lewis's hand. It's in Latin, but it's only one of a number of poems that are found in this book. And all of them are deeply unflattering portrayals of H.C. Wilde. I'll talk you through them. Loud-mouthed, a bully, publicly professing the impartial scientific attitude, yet on the point of dialects confessing how pruriently class-conscious was his mood, the miles gloriosus of phonetics, boasting his triumphs, evermore digressing to scourge dead rivals with apologetics and pat his own broad back with transient blessing. Yet did I never know his fuller power of full-fed yoked insolence till that hour, where in a mood of graciousness surprising, he told us I am far from despising the literature of England. Fact, it's true, he said those words in 1922. That one, you really get a sense that Lewis is sitting in the lecture, writing it, actually at the time, because that would fits perfectly with that. This one is an acrostic. You can see that it spells down the side. He opens and closes his glottis at pleasure, explosives and stops he is able to measure. No grunt and no gurgle escapes his attention, religiously marking each slackness and tension. You find him in air bursts, beguiling his leisure. Here's his feelings about phonetics. Can anyone blame him if, doomed to mistaking each word in its meaning, he studies the making? He reads the poems for completely the wrong reason. Condemned to be blind to the picture, the frame instead let him chip at. But why in God's name lead us from Parnassus to join your muckraking? Why, pray, should a squire of the Muse and Apollo yield thus with a living steam organ to follow? Leave us to the spirit and keep your phonetics. Don't come to the table to talk dietetics. And then this bit at the bottom where we've already had Henry Cecil Wilde, if you can see down the side. Then we've got he, and the next stanza begins, his Berkshire garden grows, I'm told, enormous marrows tinged with gold. Sadly, we don't get the rest of that poem, so we never know what Lewis had against his marrows. And then I'll just give you a translation of the Latin. Like the peace of God that keeps our hearts and minds, this book passeth all understanding. These are the rambling remarks of a man past his prime. He has undertaken a chronicle of our native language, but what he himself manages to say about it is not English at all. From the great murk of his words, I could glean nothing worth learning. I was not going bad, was I? Maybe. But then there arose in my mind the picture of a writer appropriately named Wilde. He is shameless, with the rude voice of a shrill scourge, cold-hearted and ungenerous to all. Holding in contempt the customs of the muses and of mortals and immortals, he forever speaks with menace and relentless vulgarity. To insult from his pulpit those who have no way to answer back, to espouse as well what must not be tolerated, and to terrify two female undergraduates in their vivas, these make up his chief delight. Such is an unworthy consideration of British talent. Go, take up German or Slavic studies. And that's not it, because over the page, there's three more. This first one in Old English. Remember, he was actually learning Old English at this point, but he's still composing poetry in Old English. And then one below it in Greek, and then another one in French. The Old English one, like most of these ones in foreign languages, is actually a bit of a tissue of quotations taken from the poems that he would have been studying himself. So, for instance, Laria Lados Leodharta comes, like most of these, from the poem Judith, and describes Holofernes, who's at a feast getting progressively drunker and drunker, and they're all sort of really unpleasant terms of abuse leveled at him. And let me just read you a translation of it. The worst of teachers, a tyrant. Henry was the hard-tongued man called. Wilde was an enemy to humans, awe-inspiring leader of men in Oxford. Often he laughed and roared, clamoured and made noises. After Wilde, hateful to the saviour, bloodthirsty man occupied the learning hall. Wicked scholar, mocked each of them all. His belly was wider than that of any man. And as well as being a tissue of these quotations from Judith, we also have a unique compound that Lewis creates here, the word Larzella, which he uses to mean lecture hall, which is modelled on the gold cellar, the golden hall Heorot of Beowulf. The Greek one translates like this: "Truly, what a great marvel I see with my eyes. An utterly evil monster, a big beast, came to the academy. He was speaking in a foreign tongue, fierce-eyed, a terror to mortals. Pride gave birth to this powerful agitator of fear. Pride, the most terrible darkness, goddess with a human voice. He was begotten by a baleful mortal father, wild son of raging madness, expert in cruelties." And then, finally, the unfinished French version. "How enraging, how exasperating that some useless old peasant can find himself in the company of a Raleigh or a Murray." Those are two of the great figures of the Oxford English and Classics faculties at the time. That the Academy should now have to suffer the tiresome ramblings of a miserable mutt. Although these poems are all copied into a single volume, they appear to have been entered at different times, and here I'm indebted to Charlie Starr and the excellent work that he was able to do with these poems, analysing their handwriting, and I've learnt a lot from it. The first couplet, the final couplet of poem 1, as I showed, refers to a statement made by Wilde in 1922, which, as I said, tallies nicely with when he was attending these lectures as an undergraduate. And the one thing I've picked up from Charlie that's useful, and I'll pass on to you now, is how you can see it really distinctly when he points it out, is that this one is, the handwriting leans very noticeably to the left. And that seems to be, therefore, sort of fitting with that earlier period, whereas these are much more upright. And so it seems from this that that the poems were added in a series of discrete stages rather than at one time. So this isn't just Lewis in a hot moment after a lecture just dashing this lot off. He's doing it over a period of years rather than days. And of course, it's important to note that the dates relate to the period in which they were copied into the volume and not necessarily the date of composition. But I think the likeliest explanation of the dates that's proposed by Charlie is that Lewis is returning to this volume at various points throughout the 1920s, adding new poems as they occur to him. And this scenario concurs quite closely with the evidence of the diary, which, as I've said, records him using the book in 1922 as a student, but then going back to it in 1926 and 27, preparing his teaching materials and marking student essays at Magdalen. So while the initial stimulus may have been attending Wilde's lectures on the history of English in 1922, Lewis continued to channel his dislike of Wilde and his scholarly approach in poetic form over a number of years. So I guess it's a kind of therapy. But those 6 poems are not the full extent of Lewis's satirizing of Wilde in verse. And the reason I know this is because there's an essay by Tom Shippey about the Oxford English faculty and the teaching of philology, which he is in a volume of collected papers from the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society, in which he talks about exactly the same kind of verse that I had discovered. And so as soon as I found these poems, I thought, that reminds me of Tom Shippey's discovery as well, because he says that he himself had come across a similar poem in a volume of Wilde's, one of Wilde's books. And he says, this is to quote him at length. Now, somewhere in my fairly recent travels, I've been in a study with somebody, and that somebody pulled off the shelf a copy of one of Wilde's books and opened it up and showed it to me. Inside the flyleaf of this book was a long poem in heroic couplets entirely abusive of Wilde. The whole thing had clearly been written in one of Wilde's lectures, commenting on the lecture as the poem was written, and it was a pretty good poem. What's irritating is that I've forgotten who it was, and I've been ringing people up and asking if they've got a copy and would they mind looking in the flyleaf. They all say it wasn't them. So either I dreamt it all, or it's someone I've forgotten. The point is, I can almost remember the end of the poem. It ends up something like, that fearful cad and bounder H.C. Wilde. So that immediately sounds very like the poems that I'd found, except it can't be those because none of them end that fearful cad and bounder H.C. Wilde. So, and the word cad, if you remember, I said that Lewis refers to him throughout his diary as the cad. It sounds very much like Lewis. And in fact, in a footnote in the essay, Lewis says, Shippey notes that since the poem was so witty and so metrically skillful, he wonders whether Lewis himself might be the author. And I'm sure he's right. Unfortunately, despite him ringing round all his friends like that, he's never been able to locate it. And in fact, he and I then submitted a letter to the Times Literary Supplement asking people who have copies of H.C. Wilde's books to open them up, look in them to see if they can find it. But regrettably, nobody ever came forward, and we have not yet located it. So there's one more out there. But Tom Shippey did say to me that having written an article, someone in America had got in touch with him and said, I have a copy of a book by H.C. Wilde, which has a poem in it. It's not the one you're talking about, but it's a different one. So I then wrote to him and said, can you send me a picture of that poem? Because it feels rather like it might be by C.S. Lewis. And he did. I don't have a very good image of it, unfortunately, but it very clearly is C.S. Lewis's handwriting, and it's very clearly another example of a poem that he wrote lampooning H.C. Wilde. You start to lose count. So there are no actual ownership inscriptions in this volume, but it's very clearly written in Lewis's hand. And there's another link between this poem and the ones I've just shown you, because it uses the term Miles Gloriosus, originally the title of a play by Plautus, and later used as a term in Renaissance drama for any kind of boastful soldier. Here, Wilde is the Miles Gloriosus of the schools, which is the Oxford slang for the examination schools on the high street, which is where Wilde gave his lectures and Lewis sat through them. And this is a copy of the historical study of the mother tongue, which is the very book that I mentioned earlier that Lewis has to go out and buy specially so he can mark his student essay, and then gets really annoyed when he finds out that actually it's not very helpful after all. So it seems pretty likely that this, again, is that very copy. And having experienced that frustration, he immediately wrote another poem abusing Wilde. But that's not quite all of them either, because, would you believe it? When it came to preparing for this talk, the volume that I mentioned that the poems are in, as I said, was owned by Walter Hooper, of course, very sadly passed in 2020. And I hadn't seen the volume for years. But I thought it might be a good idea to go and have another look at it, because now it's on deposit in the Bodleian Library. So I was able to go and consult it. And I looked at all the poems again, and then I turned to the back of the book. And would you believe it? There was a whole nother one. I don't know how. I mean, when Walter showed me them, did he know it was there and just keep it from me? Was he just playing with me? Or did we neither of us think to look at the back of the book? But there it is. Well, I say another one, but there are another two. There's a completer version of the French poem, the same French poem, but an alternative version. And this one is similar, but not the same as the one sent by the colleague in America. The copy in America, by the way, I should say, because it's not signed, of course, the person who owned it had no idea that it was a book owned by C.S. Lewis with an unpublished poem in it, which, he was quite pleased. But yeah, this one is another version of that. It begins with the same lines. There was a time at Oxford woes began when every lecturer was a gentleman. And you can see where it's going from there. So, yeah, there's more, but it's still not the one that Tom Shippey is talking about. So there you go. There's another one out there. Somebody surely will find it. So Lewis's experience of being lectured at by Wilde clearly fostered a suspicion of and hostility, not just towards the man himself, but towards the subject of philology that seems to have festered into the early years of his appointment as a member of the English faculty. Tolkien, on the other hand, seems to have been more positively disposed towards Wilde. Wilde died suddenly in January 1945, and in a letter to his son Christopher, Tolkien tells him of this news and adds, "God rest his soul." He does, however, notice that Wilde's unexpected demise is likely to create a degree of inconvenience for him. In a letter to Stanley Unwin in March of the same year, Tolkien laments that finding Wilde's successor will inevitably devolve onto him and thereby take up much of the vacation when he intended to do some writing. In the end, Tolkien's fear that the responsibility of replacing Wilde would fall upon him turned out to be truer than he realized, since he was himself elected as his successor. And in fact, he had to do both jobs, the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professorship of Anglo-Saxon and the Merton Professorship of English Language and Literature, for a whole year before he was able to find a replacement for himself. That Wilde and Tolkien were more than just colleagues is suggested by an anecdote that Tolkien recounts in his valedictory lecture. This is the lecture he gave when he was leaving the Oxford English faculty. And he says in that he recalls one of the high moments of his career at Oxford being witnessing Wilde wrecking a table in Oxford's Cadina Cafe with the vigour of his representation of a Finnish minstrel chanting the Kalevala. So that's a whole other side to the man that you wouldn't necessarily have guessed at. That he also shared some of Lewis's reservations about Wilde's teaching methods and their efficacy is implied by a second remark that he makes about Wilde in the same lecture. So Tolkien recalls that when Wilde was appointed to the Merton Chair in 1920, he wrote to congratulate him. And Wilde responded, saying, "If there are any Durna Gastas still about in Oxford, I will deal with them." And Tolkien's wistful observation, alas, he was not Beowulf, suggests he didn't consider that Wilde had been successful in tackling the concealed spirits that continued to oppose the philological approach in Oxford. Tolkien and Wilde would certainly have disagreed about the correct pronunciation of waistcoat, since Tolkien, of course, placed the Westcott version in the speech of Gaffer Gamgee, hardly the kind of gentleman with whom Wilde associated it. But this does fit with the Oxford English Dictionary's labelling of the Westcott form as found in what it calls representations of vulgar pronunciation. So they side with Tolkien here. But of course, that's not really surprising, because if we remember what Tolkien's first job was, it was working as an etymologist at the OED, specifically on words beginning with W. When I went and looked in the OED archives to see, sure enough, that he did the entry for waistcoat. And he wrote that same point about the pronunciation of Westcott. That is actually Tolkien. It was Tolkien's friendship with Lewis that was to challenge and finally overcome Lewis's antipathy towards a purely linguistic approach to the study of Old and Middle English texts. Lewis's account of their first meeting, which was at a meeting of the English faculty in 1926, this is the famous account in his diary, it indicates that while he found his new colleague genial and approachable, they clashed from the outset on the importance of philology to literary studies. You remember, of course, that Lewis says that he reports Tolkien's view that language is the real thing in the school, and says that he was unable to read Spenser, a poet to whom, of course, Lewis himself was devoted, because of the forms. And it's a reference to the artificial and archaic nature of the diction in which Spenser wrote. And it's presumably for that reason that Lewis sums up his initial assessment of Tolkien with that strange point: no harm in him, only needs a smack or so. And reflecting on their friendship, it's surprised by joy, Lewis recalls how, when he first arrived at the English faculty, he'd been explicitly warned to never trust a philologist. That is where I got my title from. But that his friendship with Tolkien had led him to overcome that prejudice. Having established himself in Oxford following his appointment to the Rawlinson and Bosworth Chair of Anglo-Saxon in 1925, Tolkien set out his approach to philology and his view of its role in the English syllabus in an essay entitled The Oxford English School, which was published in the Oxford Magazine in 1930. The deep division that Tolkien encountered in the Oxford English School had its origins in the initial proposals for its foundation. So it goes right back to the beginning of the establishment of an English school in Oxford. Despite a determination in those initial proposals that there should be a balance between literature and language in the syllabus that was initially set out in 1898, so as to prevent the school from being divided into two separate halves, only one of the exam papers that was finally set made any attempt to combine the two approaches. And even in that one example, rather than seeking to encourage students to apply both approaches to works by Chaucer and Piers Plowman, the examination paper included 6 literary questions and then 6 questions dealing with philology, completely separate. And D.J. Palmer, in his account of the rise of English studies as a discipline, considers this to epitomize the artificial and mechanical balance between the two sides of the school and the failure to reconcile them properly. It's indicative of the influence Tolkien was to have over Lewis that he came to support Tolkien's proposed syllabus, with its focus on philology and the study of Old and Middle English language. The extent of the hostility that the two of them encountered, sparked by their conspiratorial plotting, is apparent from Lewis's warning Tolkien to be on his guard when they're amongst their fellow colleagues. "Forgive me," he writes, "if I remind you that there are disguised orcs behind every tree." Their combined efforts were successful in moulding a new syllabus in 1931, along the lines set out in the article Tolkien had published in the Oxford Magazine, requiring all students to engage in detailed study of the language of medieval texts. And Lewis described their victory to his brother Warren in a letter, calling it a great feather in my cap, characterizing their success as having forced the new syllabus upon the junto after much hard fighting. And in his diary, Tolkien privately admitted that the reformed syllabus went beyond his wildest hopes. But Lewis's conversion to philology may not mark the end of his campaign of hostility against H.C. Wilde. Sorry, there's a bit more to come. In the meantime, Wilde had continued his promotion of the superiority of the standard form of the English language. In 1934, he published his most outspokenly prescriptive statement concerning its merits in relation to dialect usage in a tract that was issued by a body known as the Society for Pure English. And the title of the tract was The Best English, a claim for the superiority of received standard English. Both the title of the tract itself and of the society responsible for its publication unashamedly highlight the linguistic agenda which this argument is serving. So here, the best English, what he calls received standard English, is somewhat circularly defined as that spoken by the best people, i.e. members of the highest social class who went to the best great public schools. In it, Wilde concedes that dialect speech is acceptable in the provinces and among the uneducated, but views it as totally unacceptable amongst educated speakers of the highest social classes. And he therefore urges that dialect speakers who aspire to public office should aim to eliminate the grosser forms of provincialisms. According to Wilde, the finest exponents of received standard English are British army officers, the modern equivalents of the great men of the Elizabethan court. The utterance of these men, he says, is at once clear-cut and precise, yet free from affectation, at once downright and manly, yet in the highest degree refined and urbane. The publication of the tract coincided with the appearance of a poem in the Oxford magazine, unsigned, with the title, The King's English, and accompanied by an explanation underneath it that reads, Professor H.C. Wilde is of the opinion that the best English is most consistently heard at its best among officers of the British regular army. I've just given you the first 4 stanzas of it here. It's quite long. And it says, our officers and gentlemen have now another claim to back their reputation as to how to play the game. They hold the King's commission and his uniform they wear, but the way they speak his English is quite beyond compare. For purity of language, both ante-room and mess show how an English gentleman may best himself express. No longer can the pulpits or the college lecture rooms compare with parade ground where the brevet major booms. And it goes on in that vein for some time. So although the poem is unsigned, its sarcastic treatment of Wilde's tract is entirely in keeping with the attitude displayed in Lewis's earlier verse lampoons, suggesting that he may be its author. But while the content and attitude towards Wilde's thesis that it portrays align closely with Lewis's earlier verses, its rhymes, including half-rhymes like wrong and tongue, pride, brigade, are, and regular, do set it apart from those other poems, but it might be that he's playing some joke there, I think, with the pronunciations. It forces you to say pride and brigade, for instance. But it may be that it's not Lewis's work, it's some other Oxonian irritated by Wilde and the claims of his tract, showing us that the opposition to this kind of viewpoint and Wilde's class consciousness in the university at that time. The question of the balance of the language and literature components of the Oxford English syllabus came up for reconsideration again in the early 1950s. A subcommittee was formed and tasked with devising proposals that would be voted on at a full meeting of the faculty. Tolkien, now the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature, was made a member of this working party. And the final proposals that it came up with included the restoration of Victorian literature and, most scandalously, even a foray into the 20th century. Lewis was incensed at Tolkien's decision to turn away against the syllabus the two of them had devised in the 1930s. His scorn for the new proposals is apparent from a poem that he wrote and submitted to the editor of the Oxford magazine, titled Ichabod, meaning the glory has departed. The poem ruefully records how the march of progress has compelled the English school to pare down the Middle Ages, to prune Bowery Spencer to a leafless stick, and fob off Milton with the same share as once fell to Hockleave, Hunt and Blair. And it concludes, small is the loss, their works are out of touch with life, i.e. not read at Cambridge much. But the poem was never published because the result of Lewis's vigorous campaigning and passionate oratory meant that the majority of the English faculty members rejected the new syllabus. Even Tolkien was persuaded to vote against the proposals he himself had contributed to devising. The scornful reference at the end there to the Cambridge English school, with the implication of its relative inferiority, is ironic, since, of course, in 1954, Lewis took up the newly established Chair of Medieval Renaissance Studies at Cambridge. But in switching to the Cambridge English School, Lewis found himself in a department with little interest in formal language study. And at Cambridge, Lewis appears to have ended his long-standing spat with Wilde and philology, only to encounter a whole new one in the form of F.R. Leavis and the study of what Lewis himself referred to scornfully as literary criticism with the largest possible capitals for both words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horobin. Again, we have two microphones for questions. Questions, not lectures. We provide the lectures. Keep them short so we can squeeze in many.
How is Lewis received at Magdalen College now and the university more widely?
Thanks, Andrew. I would say it's changed a lot in the 18 years I've been there. I think it's become, I think when I arrived, there were still some older fellows who remembered him and who had strong views one way or another. Didn't always remember him positively. There was some hostility because most of those now have moved away. I think things have changed. I think most people now recognize that he is one of our most illustrious predecessors and that many people who come to the college are coming because Lewis was there. As you know, I have an exhibition in the old library. It's the most successful exhibition in terms of visitor numbers we've ever had. And I think that's helped to make the case. But I think I can't imagine having an exhibition like that from when I first started. So I think, I think the college has changed in that time. And I think that's led to more acceptance and more awareness and more interest in him as a figure.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was really great. It reminds me of, I wonder what you think about, if you've read Betjeman's comments about philology, when, he's essentially complaining about what Lewis is doing to him, studying all that philology. And do we ever have any reflections on C.S. Lewis that I am now inflicting on other people? What was inflicted on me?
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? I think probably part of his frustration with Betjeman was that he didn't do any work and that he ultimately you have to get through it. And therefore, it's up to me to try and, ensure that you do the work. But you're right. You think he might have had more sympathy. And of course, Betjeman did have literary interests, but you think that might have brought the two men together in some ways. I mean, Betjeman's were more of a kind of arcane Victoriana, which wasn't really part of the syllabus. And Betjeman did write that letter to him, which he never sent, which was very self-justificatory about, how I really resent the fact that you didn't recognize, my literary interests and you should have nurtured me more and so on. And there's another letter which I found, I write about it in the book, which hasn't been published, sort of strangely, because it's in Betjeman's letters in the same collection that other letters have been published, in which Lewis says, he's responding to a letter from Betjeman, and he says, well, I may have more to apologize for than I realized at the time. I was a young tutor in those days. And I think he was one of his first year groups that he was tutoring. And I think he may have himself just been a bit too kind of, not sympathetic enough. and too tough on him, thinking he was doing the right thing. But yeah, it is ironic, I think. It's true.
Thank you, Simon, for a great talk. I think possibly for reasons of time, you didn't read us all the poems you showed. Would you possibly be able to read that full page one that you didn't go through? Could you go through that now?
Yeah, I'll just have to I'll get it off my computer. There was a time our Oxford woes began, when every lecturer was a gentleman, when spirits humane were dons in Saturn's reign. So that might be what you were looking for there, was it, Michael? Their discourse easy and their wit urbane, but golden ages pass without repeal, and wild as ushered in the age of steel. Enormous wild, of whom the muses sung, that from no mortal seed the portent sprang. But insolence, dire goddess, Stygian whore, to several sires the barking infant bore. Insolence, Charon's daughter, loosed her zone to Braggadocio, nor to him alone, for pistol too her couch did next enjoy, and kestrel topped her third, that roaring boy. Thence grew the windy babe, who showed the fires of all his mother and of all his sires. Even in his cradle boomed the boastful child. The infernal gossips shrieked and called him wild. Escaped from hell, his earthly life began in Cardiff as a lavatory man, whom soon the corporation, when they found him stealing paper, spewed from underground. Next, as a New York peeler, clubbing beggars and cripples, he was pensioned by bootleggers, until, for being bribed to get a black a lynching, he was given at last the sack. Thence he returned, and since he could not be a sergeant major, learned philology. Seized on a chair, talked louder, and became our joke in Oxford, and abroad our shame. The miles gloriosus of the schools, the scorn of scholars, and the fear of fools. Loud among women at the viva board, but humble to a millionaire or lord. In peaceful times a Tory, but nigh red, when guns are cocked and riot acts are read. The genuine race of the Tartarian whore, the bully, coward, braggart, snob, and bore.
Thank you so much. Really great thinking about language and how it functions. I know that these writings came into English later in the 70s and 80s, the works of Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian form critic, who says that philologists kill a language, then they breathe life into its corpse, or at least they try to do that, pointing out that really the way language develops is really on the street. And you have those who try to standardize it who are never going to win because the street is always going to win. Anyway, within the Lewis and Wilde schools, has there been any engagement of Bakhtin and ways that language functions, those kind of things?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the point that Lewis was making about the lectures is, he gets that. He's not engaging with Bakhtin, but he says, that ultimately, these efforts, it's about the kind of, the way that Wilde is trying to prevent them saying waistcoat rather than waistcoat, and that language changes irrespective of attempts to try and stop it being changed. And, I think he understood that, although he was not really a philologist in practice, he understood, studies in words, for instance, is a good example of how you can trace language change, and that you're not sort of saying that there's no kind of concept of it degenerating or improving, or these are just changes in meaning. I think maybe as well his upbringing in Belfast gave him a different perspective on, when you listen to him, he sounds very Oxford. But, he came from outside the academy. And so maybe Lewis just had a better understanding of what dialect was and accent is. And there's that nice bit, isn't there, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, where Mrs. Beaver says, where they think it's the White Witch coming. And then she says, "It's all right, it isn't her." And then the narrator says, which was bad grammar, of course. But then when beavers are excited, they sometimes forget their grammar. He can have a joke with it, but I don't think he thinks it's serious.
Thank you. You mentioned that these debates are still going on in Oxford today regarding the English syllabus. I was wondering if Lewis and Tolkien still play a role in those debates, or has the English department largely moved on from the kinds of debates they were having back then?
They probably don't directly have a place in it, in the sense that nobody's going back to Tolkien's essay in 1930 and seeing, what was his vision and could we implement it. The course that they devised is still part of the course. I mean, it's now a kind of specialist option that students can choose at the end of their first year, and about between 30 and 50 do every year. So that has had real longevity. But nowadays it's more about the role of language would include philology, the historical study of language, but it also includes, of course, things like sociolinguistics, for instance, language and identity, language and gender, lots of topics that wouldn't have occurred to Tolkien to think of as language study at the time, I suspect. So they don't directly, but their legacy is still felt in the courses we study it today.
Simon, you're basically or essentially successor to C.S. Lewis in Magdalen, whether you knew it or not when you took the job. You're the one who succeeded him with a higher rank as professor. And many of us, look to you as an access person for Magdalen. And many of us are infatuated, and we romanticize the room where Lewis hosted the Inklings, his friends. Can you just say a word about the room where it happened?
Well, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because first time I ever went in that room was about 2 years ago, I think. Was it with you, Andrew? Yeah. And you, and there, of course, you were there as well. Yeah. And that was the first time I'd ever done it. So it struck me as odd in a way, because I'd been there for so long, but it never really occurred to me to do that myself. And I think that's sort of part of being there, is that, I have a teaching room which is 2 staircases along, and the room I teach in is very like the one. It's identical to one of Lewis's rooms. Anyway, there's this big sitting room. So I suppose, in a sense, it doesn't feel that different to me to go into that room. It just feels like any other room that I'm used to visiting. But of course, when you do go into it, it does feel different, if that makes sense, because you suddenly realize, hang on, this is where they sat and read these works to each other. And when you go into the little back bedroom, and you remember that bit in Surprised by Joy where it says, you must picture me night after night in that room at Magdalen. So you can't really get away from the significance of that, I think. And people are always astonished when I've taken a few groups in there now, that there's nothing in there to say that this is where it was. And that actually, if you remember when we went in there, that the research students whose office it is now had no idea. They wondered why we were all coming in. So yeah, that's odd in a way. I suppose it sort of feels like it's your workplace, but at the same time you're sort of conscious of that. And most people think it's odd that it's not a museum. I think one of the things that did get me interested in, and why I wrote the book, C.S. Lewis's Oxford, is sort of doing that job and being in that space makes you just conscious that you do have a particular take on Lewis, because of being there, and these things that seem kind of quirky and odd to everybody outside Oxford do seem sort of normal to me now.
When we were there with you last year, I remember you with a book with some photographs of Lewis at the bookshelf, standing there, and you went to where he was standing in the photograph, and we were trying to imagine, a time warp. And I was just asking if you had any romantic ideas about such a space, and you've answered that, what it feels like to be there. Some of us feel it's rather magical.
Yeah. The idea of being his successor, that just feels daunting. And I remember with someone telling me that when I first arrived, that a colleague had said, "Oh yeah, we've replaced C.S. Lewis, this chap called Simon Horobin." I was like, "No, please don't go around saying that." You know, the thing I always remind people is that Lewis taught the whole of the English syllabus. And okay, you know, it didn't go up to, 20th century, but he taught the whole thing. We now have 3 tutors in English, and I do up to 1,500. And he also taught philosophy, and he taught political theory to the historians. So the range that he could teach was astonishing. And the other thing I found is that he was doing, because there weren't many English tutors around in Oxford at those days, he was still teaching for decades at his undergraduate college, UNIV, because they didn't have an English tutor. He was teaching at New College and at a number of the ladies' colleges as well. So it's astonishing to think, when did he write all these books that we read?
Thank you. I just have a question. But first, thank you so much for introducing us to so much memorabilia of Lewis. It's really very interesting. And a technical question is, so how do you feel about the publication of these poems and writings that you find in the flyleaves of books? Is that something that should be, for people doing research today, is that something that needs to be published, or is it something that publication would not be a good idea? What's your thoughts on that?
Definitely, they should be published. Yeah, and most of these recently have been, because I did publish them just a month or 2 ago. Annoyingly, I then found that those other 2 that I showed you. But yeah, I think this is part of this. We've heard about a number of new discoveries already just in the first day of this conference. So it's exciting to think how much material is still out there. And just in the bit of the Lewis world that I've been looking into, which is mostly kind of college archives around Oxford and so on, you just find lots of traces of him. There are lots of letters. People who, since my book came out, I've had a number of people write to me and saying, I've got some letters that were written to my dad by C.S. Lewis. Would you be interested in seeing them? I don't want to trouble you. So I think that there's a lot of material out there. And yes, definitely, let's get it all in print so we can all see it.
Would you join me in thanking Dr. Horobin?